Okay, so you're here again because, we cut right to the chase to get to the heart of it and maybe spark some of those aha moments along the way.
Right to the good stuff without getting overwhelmed.
Exactly. And today we're diving into something that's a pretty hot topic right now. I mean, it's everywhere you look how we're thinking about what it means to be a man today in this crazy modern world.
Yeah, and you've gathered an incredibly diverse group of voices for this, too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we've got Anthony Mackie,
Yeah.
Crew U, Ryan Michler over at Order of Man. We've even got some cowboy wisdom from Dry Creek Dwayne.
Real deal cowboy.
And a couple of really outspoken commentators, Matt Walsh and Zuby.
Yeah, so we're kind of all over the map here.
Yeah.
We got Hollywood, we got self-improvement, we got cultural commentary.
And then you've also pulled in some broader research and articles about how this whole idea of masculinity is shifting right in front of us.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's really what we're digging into today. What are these different voices saying about being a man in 2023? What are the real challenges guys are facing? And how is this whole concept of masculinity changing? I mean, is it evolving? Is it disappearing? I mean, what's going on?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
Well, I think one of the best places to start is by looking back, right? Going back to the basics.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
What was considered masculine traditionally, before the world went and shifted on us.
Yeah, well, a lot of your text sources actually touch on that.
Right.
Historically, masculinity was really wrapped up in a few key things.
Yeah.
Physical strength, dominance, and
Yeah.
stoicism, being able to control your emotions.
Right, the strong silent type.
Yeah, exactly. And think about it, most of the roles men held, throughout history, it made sense, right? The military, physically demanding jobs, being the main breadwinner in the family, all of that kind of naturally emphasized and rewarded those specific traits.
Right, the provider, the protector, the tough guy. Exactly.
But like you said, the world has changed a lot, and all of these sources really shine a light on how much things have shifted. Like even in education, we're seeing women outpacing men in college enrollment and graduation rates. It's a huge shift.
It is. And it's not just education, it's the job market too.
Yeah.
Manufacturing jobs, those traditional male-dominated roles, they're declining while service industries are booming. It's completely flipped the script on what those traditional roles even look like.
Yeah, and it's not all sunshine and roses. The data on men's mental health is pretty alarming.
Oh, absolutely.
Higher suicide rates among men and this reluctance to seek help for mental health issues. It really makes you wonder if that old pressure to just man up and bottle it all up, if that's actually backfiring in a big way.
It's definitely something to consider. I mean, that pressure to suppress your emotions, it might not be the healthiest approach.
Right. So with all of that in mind, the historical context, the societal shifts,
Yeah.
let's jump into some of these individual voices because they bring some really interesting perspectives to the table. Yeah, definitely. Let's start with Anthony Mackie.
Yeah, the Falcon himself.
In his video for mediocre tutorials and reviews, he comes right out and says he feels like masculinity has been killed.
Wow.
Over the past 20 years in our homes, in our communities. He's seeing it everywhere.
Yeah, and his whole approach to raising his sons is really interesting.
Oh, absolutely.
He's all about instilling those basic values of respect, saying yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, opening doors for people and taking care of their mother. He's really adamant about that.
Yeah, and it's more than just being polite. It's about responsibility, too.
Right.
He even talks about teaching his 15-year-old son to be the man of the house when he's gone, emphasizing that sense of protection and responsibility within the family.
It's like that classic image of the man as the protector, the one who takes charge.
Yeah, exactly. And he's not afraid to call out what he sees as hypocrisy,
Oh,
He's
right.
a bit skeptical of some Hollywood actors who seem to change their tone depending on what's popular or what's going to make them money.
Yeah, he definitely comes across as someone who sticks to his convictions.
He does. And he also brings up this really important point about managing your reactions. He uses that analogy of don't wrestle with pigs,
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
right? It's about choosing your battles, being strategic, and not letting yourself get dragged down by things that aren't worth your energy.
Don't get down in the mud.
Exactly. And something else that really struck me was his worry that young boys are now afraid to fail.
Yeah, he really contrasts that with his own childhood.
He does. He talks about how much more physical play there was, more risk-taking back then. And he's concerned that this fear of failure could actually be holding boys back from trying new things and building that resilience they need.
Right, because failing is part of learning and growing.
Absolutely. And he even shares this quick anecdote about his nephew having a negative encounter with a woman. which kind of hints at the complexities of those social dynamics between young men and women today.
Yeah, it's like navigating those interactions can be a minefield sometimes.
It can be. And I really appreciate how Maggie talks about setbacks too.
Oh, yeah.
Like when a movie he's in doesn't do well, he doesn't let it define him.
Sure.
It's about the bigger picture, the whole journey.
Not just one single moment.
Exactly. And he even touches on the idea that being physically strong and being able to express your emotions aren't mutually exclusive.
Yeah, that's a big one.
He uses this analogy of working out a muscle. You've got to exercise both your physical strength and your emotional capacity to be truly strong.
Right. Emotional intelligence is a muscle, too.
It is. It's
Yeah.
like any other skill, it needs to be developed.
I like that. And it's interesting how Mackie circles back to that initial feeling he has that the American male is somehow diminished.
He does, but then he kind of balances it out by emphasizing personal responsibility.
Right.
It's like he's acknowledging this perceived cultural shift,
Huh.
but ultimately he believes that your life outcomes depend on the choices you make and the effort you put in.
Yeah, so it's not just about lamenting what's changed, it's about taking ownership.
It's exactly. Now, let's shift gears a bit and look at Cru's message in his Be a Man video.
Okay, yeah.
He seems to be focusing more on those internal qualities, wouldn't he say?
Oh, definitely. His whole message is about that inner strength.
Right.
Standing up for what you believe in, even when it's hard, making tough choices. And maybe this is surprising, but being comfortable being alone, being self-reliant.
Yeah, it's less about external validation and more about that inner fortitude, that unshakable core.
And he has this really interesting and kind of edgy way of putting it.
Oh, yeah.
He says you got to fuck it all up a little bit to become a man.
Yeah, that got my attention too.
Right, and that real learning often comes from letting go of those old ways of thinking, letting them die off to make space for something new.
Yeah, it's like a process of shedding those outdated beliefs and being willing to make mistakes along the way.
Embrace the mess.
Yeah, and he even talks about this feeling of emptiness, a hole, when those old parts of you are gone, and the need to find the right food, the right influences and ideas to fill that void.
Right, so it's like a constant process of evolving.
Absolutely. Self-discovery never really ends.
Now, Ryan Michler from Order of Man, he takes a totally different approach.
Oh, yeah. He's much more structured.
Yeah, he lays out this really clear set of strategies for becoming a compelling man.
Right. And he's very specific about what he means by compelling.
Yeah, it's not just about being charming. It's about commanding attention and respect.
Exactly. It's about having that presence that draws people in and makes them want to follow your lead.
Right. So it's not just for show. It's about being effective in your life as a father, a partner, a leader.
And he stresses that this isn't about ego either.
Okay.
It's about building the kind of influence that allows you to achieve your goals and work collaboratively with others. Because in his view, true success often comes from partnership, not just going it alone.
Yeah, I like that. And he breaks it all down into these 12 practical strategies.
He does. It's almost like a checklist.
Yeah, things like making eye contact, a framed handshake, but not too firm.
Right. Don't crush anyone's hand.
Yeah, speaking clearly, walking with purpose, good posture. Those are all about projecting confidence.
Exactly. Those are the initial signals you send out.
And he goes beyond just the physical, too.
Oh, yeah.
Being genuinely interested in other people, being interesting yourself, by having unique experiences, being a good storyteller. And that includes things like your tone of voice, your pacing.
Absolutely. And he emphasizes dressing well, too, making sure your clothes fit and are appropriate for the occasion.
Right, looking the part.
Yeah, and taking care of your physical health, too.
Yeah.
Managing your weight, staying strong, those things matter.
And he wraps it all up with a focus on communication and engagement.
Right, being a good storyteller, someone who can teach through their stories, and something as simple as smiling.
Yeah, it's amazing how much a smile can do.
It really can, and what I appreciate is that Mischler doesn't just focus on the external. He makes it clear that all of this has to be built on a foundation of real character.
Okay.
He actually says if someone's full of garbage inside, it's going to show no matter how well they try to present themselves.
Yeah, you can't fake it forever.
Exactly. So these strategies should enhance who you are, not try to replace it.
Right. Be authentic.
He also dedicates a whole section to conversing like a man, not a boy.
Yeah.
Which is all about using communication effectively to get better results in all areas of life.
Right. Communicating like a grown-up.
Exactly. And he draws a clear distinction between mature, productive conversation and those more adolescent behaviors like yelling or whining.
Yeah, nobody wants to be that guy.
No, and his 5 standard operating procedures for good communication are really insightful.
Lay 'em on me.
Okay, so the first one is pick your fights.
Okay.
Be selective about what you engage in. Don't waste your time and energy on every argument that comes your way.
Right. Choose your battles.
Exactly. The second one is to set and know the terms of the discussion.
Okay.
Establish boundaries and be willing to disengage if those boundaries are constantly violated.
Right. Walking away is okay sometimes.
The third principle is to approach conversations with the goal of learning and sharing knowledge, not just trying to win the argument.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It's about prioritizing understanding over ego.
Ego is the enemy sometimes.
Often. And the fourth one is to engage with intellectual honesty,
Okay.
which means being aware of those logical fallacies, those little tricks we use in arguments that actually weaken our position.
Give me an example.
Sure, so like a false dichotomy, that's when you present only two options, when there might be many more. A straw man argument, where you misrepresent someone's view to make it easier to attack a loaded question, where you bake an assumption into the question itself, or an appeal to authority, where you say something's true just because someone important said it without any real evidence.
Okay. Yeah, I've definitely seen those in action.
We all have. And the final point is to know your information.
Okay.
Be well informed about what you're talking about and be willing to admit when you don't know something.
Right. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know.
Exactly. He really hammers home the idea that effective communication, it's a foundational skill that improves all areas of your life. Relationships, work, everything.
Communication is key.
It really is. And now let's switch gears again and hear from Dry Creek Dwayne.
All right, the cowboy.
Yeah. Chris Williamson's conversation with him is really interesting. It's a lot more personal and reflective.
Right. He's sharing his own journey.
Yeah, and a big part of that journey has been managing his anger.
Okay.
He talks
That's-
about finding balance through self-reflection reading and his connection with nature, especially horses.
That's cool.
It is. And what's really fascinating is how he describes horses being able to sense your emotional state.
Really?
Yeah, it's like they can pick up on those unspoken cues, those feelings you might be trying to hide.
Wow. So it's like a reminder that even when we think we're keeping it all inside, other people and even animals can often sense what's going on.
Exactly. And he credits a lot of his understanding of horses and himself to a guy named Buck Brannaman, who's a pretty legendary horse trainer.
Okay, so he's learned a lot from those interactions.
He has, and he's pretty upfront about his approach to handling difficult emotions.
Yeah.
His go-to phrase is, suck it up.
Old school.
Yeah. But he also makes a really important distinction. He says that while you might need to manage those tough feelings internally, you shouldn't let them turn into something toxic that you take out on other people.
Right, so it's not about bottling it up and exploding later.
Exactly, and he even tells this story about riding a horse with broken ribs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, talk about tough.
That's commitment.
It is, but the conversation goes deeper than just suck it up.
Okay.
They talk about finding that balance between strength and vulnerability, rationality, and emotionality.
Yeah, those are the big ones.
They are, and Dwayne believes that each man needs to find his own equilibrium in those areas.
Right. What works for one guy might not work for another.
Exactly, and he even expresses some concern that the increased focus on men's mental health, while important, could potentially swing too far the other way. Like if it's not approached thoughtfully, it could lead to this perception of weakness or fragility.
Yeah, I see what he's saying.
And I really liked his analogy using the three tennis champions, Nadal, Djokovic, and Federer.
Oh, yeah.
They all have completely different playing styles and personalities, but they've all achieved incredible success.
Right, different paths to the same goal.
Exactly. It's like a reminder that there's no one right way to be a man.
Multiple ways to win.
And he has some really straightforward advice for young men, too.
What's that?
He says, don't believe everything you think.
Okay.
And take a moment to question those initial reactions and impulses before you act on them.
Right, pause before you react.
Exactly. And he really emphasizes understanding the why behind your actions.
Okay.
Focusing on becoming a better person for the people around you, not just for your own ego or validation.
So it's about more than just yourself.
It is. And he's really open about his own journey of learning to be kinder to himself.
Yeah.
Extending the same grace he would give a friend to himself.
Self-compassion.
Exactly. And he also talks about being really intentional with his business decisions, making sure they align with his values and who he is at his core.
Right, so it's like living in alignment.
It is. And he shares this realization he had in his late 20s that achieving all this external success didn't automatically mean he felt good about himself.
Yeah, that happens a lot, actually.
It does. And so he really emphasizes the importance of keeping the promises you make to yourself and not basing your self-worth on what other people think.
Right, so it's about that internal validation.
And he also touches on some of those bigger cultural conversations, the crisis of masculinity, the impact of fatherlessness, and what young men are actually asking for guidance on.
Which is what?
Well, it might surprise you, but a lot of it is relationship advice
Hmm.
and trying to understand women.
Really?
Yeah, it's like they're trying to navigate these complex social dynamics, and they're looking for practical advice in areas that go beyond just being strong or successful.
Right, so it's a more nuanced picture.
It is. And now let's look at the Valuetainment video, The Rise of Weak Men. This one takes a more provocative approach.
How so?
They directly contrast that traditional image of the man's man with all the talk about toxic masculinity.
Okay.
And they openly question whether men are becoming soft.
Yeah, that's a loaded term.
It is, and they draw these comparisons between historical examples of men showing incredible strength and sacrifice and some of the behaviors they're observing in society today.
Right, so they're kind of setting up this contract.
They are, and they bring in some statistics from Scott Galloway that highlight some pretty concerning trends among young men.
Like what?
Higher rates of drug use, incarceration,
Yeah.
homelessness, declining enrollment in college, overdose deaths, suicides, involvement in mass violence. It's a pretty sobering list.
Wow. Yeah, that's heavy.
It is. And Galloway's solution is pretty blunt.
What does he say?
He says, focus on making money, getting physically strong, and forming meaningful connections, including romantic relationships.
Okay, so it's like back to basics.
Yeah. And the video also presents data showing a decline in average physical strength metrics over the past 30 years.
Like what kind of metrics?
Bench press, squat, grip strength, things like that.
So they're using that as evidence of this potential decline.
They are. And they also share this anecdote about a woman at a conference who had this realization that what really drove her was a desire for significance,
Oh, okay.
which adds another layer to understanding male motivation.
Right, it's not always just about power or dominance.
Now, Matt Walsh, in his video, this How to Fix the Masculinity Crisis,
Yeah.
he starts by pointing out that a huge majority of Americans still want to have children, like over 90%.
That's a lot.
It is, and it's been consistent for decades.
Okay, so that desire is still there.
It is. But then he presents data showing a pretty significant drop in average testosterone levels in young men since the 1980s.
Really?
Yeah, and the medical community doesn't fully understand why.
Huh, that's interesting.
It is, the numbers he cites are pretty dramatic, like a significant average decrease in testosterone levels, and more young men are being diagnosed with testosterone deficiency.
Oh.
And it's not just testosterone. He also talks about the huge drop in sperm count since the 1970s.
Seriously.
Yeah, and he points to potential environmental factors, things like endocrine disrupting chemicals that might be messing with our hormones.
So it's like something in our environment could be contributing.
It's possible. And he also brings in research that links early exposure to pornography with lower hormone levels and sperm quality in adulthood.
Okay, so that's another factor.
It could be, and then you combine that with the fact that more men under 30 are single and people are getting married later in life.
Right.
And the birth rate in the U.S. is actually below replacement level,
Meaning what?
meaning we're not having enough babies to replace the population.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a trend to watch. And Walsh even goes so far as to suggest that maybe the system benefits from having men be more passive or numb.
Okay, that's a bold statement.
It is, but his main takeaway and his solution are focused on individual choices.
Okay, so what does he say?
He says reduce screen time, cut back on pornography, and actively pursue real relationships and start families earlier in adulthood.
Okay, so he's saying take control.
Exactly. Now, the Valuetainment video titled, Why Men Live Harder Lives Than Women.
All right.
They focus on the biological realities of reproduction.
Yeah.
And they point out that statistically, a much smaller percentage of men actually reproduce compared to women.
Really?
Yeah, they use this analogy of sales,
Okay.
where men are like salespeople and women are like clients with different price points.
Interesting analogy.
Right. And the idea is that men often need to work harder to become the kind of person that desirable partners are looking for.
So it's like you got to up your game.
Yeah. And they also address that potential for bitterness and resentment that can happen after relationships end.
Right, especially if you feel like you did everything right.
Exactly. And they emphasize taking responsibility for your own choices and actions instead of just blaming other people.
So owning your part in it.
Yeah. And finally, we've got Zuby's perspective in his video, Why So Many Men Today Are Weak.
Okay.
He attributes some of this perceived weakness to the comfort of modern life in the West.
Okay, so we've gotten too soft.
That's his argument. Basically, we're insulated from hardship, and so we have a lower tolerance for discomfort.
Right. We can't handle the heat.
Exactly. And he also criticizes what he sees as a lack of courage in institutions to address certain issues, specifically mentioning gender ideology.
Okay, so he's calling out what he sees as cowardice.
He is, and he claims that some of these modern ideologies are pretty fringe when you compare them to a broader global and historical perspective.
Okay, so he's saying we've lost sight of the bigger picture.
Yeah, and he also talks about the negative impact of all this media and internet content, information overload, short attention spans.
Right, we're constantly bombarded.
We are, and he believes that this makes us focus too much on the present moment and lose that historical perspective.
Yeah, that long-term view.
And he goes so far as to call gender ideology an assault on truth. Yeah, he believes it has these far-reaching negative consequences that go way beyond just children and women.
Oh, yeah.
He argues that it actually affects our ability to perceive reality itself.
So it's like a fundamental distortion.
That's how he sees it, and he uses the simple analogy of squares and circles
Okay.
to illustrate how these categories are fundamentally different and can't be mixed up.
Right, you can't turn a square into a circle.
Exactly.
Wow. So that was quite the deep dive.
It was.
It's clear that this whole idea of masculinity in today's world is super complex, and there's so many different ways to look at it.
Absolutely. We've heard arguments about traditional masculinity declining the need for inner strength. Very practical strategies for being more compelling, personal stories of finding balanced concerns about physical and biological changes, and even these big cultural and ideological critiques.
Right. So it's not a simple issue.
It's not. And I think what we see emerging from all of these different voices isn't necessarily that masculinity is disappearing, but that it's undergoing this massive transformation.
Right. So it's evolving.
Exactly. And it's happening in response to all these huge changes in our society, our economy, our culture.
Yeah. And there's definitely tension, right?
Oh, yeah.
We've got these debates about traditional roles versus modern expectations, the critique of toxic masculinity, and this growing recognition of qualities like empathy, emotional intelligence, and connection.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is, but I think we did a pretty good job of laying it all out there.
I think so, too.
So for you listening out there, here's a final thought to chew on as you go about your day.
Okay.
Considering all these different perspectives and how quickly the world is changing, what aspects of traditional masculinity do you think are still essential and valuable today?
That's a good question.
And what new understandings of manhood do you find most compelling or even necessary for navigating this crazy modern world?
Yeah, I mean, what does it even mean to be a man in 2023?
Right. And ultimately, what responsibility does each individual man have in defining his own masculinity?
Food for thought.
For sure.